The morning sun cast long shadows across the military courthouse as Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison adjusted his dress uniform one final time. The Victoria Cross gleamed on his chest, its bronze surface catching the light that filtered through the tall windows. For 15 years he had worn this medal with pride, a symbol of the day he single-handedly saved 37 soldiers from enemy fire in Afghanistan. Morrison's weathered hands trembled slightly as he straightened his shoulders. At 52, he had seen more battles than most men could imagine, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The courtroom behind those heavy oak doors would decide his fate and possibly strip him of the highest military honor his country could bestow. The charges were serious: misconduct in public office, abuse of authority, misappropriation of military funds intended for veteran rehabilitation programs. The newspapers had been relentless in their coverage, painting him as a fallen hero who had betrayed the very people he once fought to protect. The headlines screamed accusations that cut deeper than any enemy blade ever could. His wife Sarah had begged him not to attend today. She knew what the military tribunal would likely decide. The evidence seemed overwhelming, carefully constructed, by prosecutors who had spent months building their case. Bank records, witness testimonies, documentation that painted a picture of a decorated soldier who had lost his way and stolen from those who needed help most. Morrison walked slowly toward the courthouse entrance, each step echoing off the marble floors. Fellow officers he had served with for decades avoided his gaze. Some whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. How could someone who had risked everything to save lives now stand accused of destroying them? The media circus outside was in full swing. Reporters thrust microphones toward him, shouting questions about his guilt, his intentions, his thoughts on potentially losing his Victoria Cross. Camera flashes exploded around him like battlefield artillery, but Morrison kept his eyes fixed straight ahead. He had learned long ago that sometimes the only way through hell was to keep moving forward. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Military officials filled the gallery, their faces stern and unforgiving. The prosecution team sat confidently at their table, thick folders of evidence spread before them like weapons ready for deployment. Morrison's own legal team looked worried, whispering urgently among themselves as they reviewed their notes one final time. Judge, Advocate General Patricia Wells entered the room with the authority of someone who had presided over countless military tribunals. Her reputation was legendary, fair but uncompromising, known for her ability to see through deception and her commitment to military justice. She had sent decorated officers to prison before, and everyone in the room knew she would not hesitate to do so again if the evidence warranted it. As Morrison took his seat at the defendant's table, he caught sight of several veterans in the gallery. These were men and women he had served with, fought beside, and in some cases saved from certain death. Their presence felt like both support and judgment, a reminder of the brotherhood he was accused of betraying. The prosecutor, Colonel David Hayes, rose to begin his opening statement. Hayes was known throughout the military legal system as a ruthless opponent who never took cases he could not win. His voice carried across the silent courtroom as he outlined the charges, describing how Morrison had allegedly diverted funds, meant to help wounded veterans, into his own personal accounts. According to Hayes, Morrison had used his position and reputation to manipulate the system. He had created fake invoices, forged signatures, and convinced well-meaning donors that their money was going to help soldiers transition back to civilian life. Instead, the prosecutor claimed, Morrison had used the funds to pay off gambling debts and maintain a lifestyle beyond his military salary. The evidence seemed damning. Bank statements showing large deposits into accounts connected to Morrison, signatures on documents that appeared to be forgeries, testimony from financial institutions that painted a picture of deception and fraud. Hayes methodically presented each piece of evidence, building a case that seemed impossible to refute. Morrison's defense attorney, Major Rebecca Chen, had warned him that the prosecution's case was strong. Too strong, perhaps, but she had also noticed something that troubled her: inconsistencies in the timeline, witnesses whose stories seemed too perfectly aligned, evidence that appeared almost too clean and organized. As the first day of proceedings drew to a close, Morrison sat in silence, listening to the charges that could cost him everything he had worked for throughout his military career. The Victoria Cross on his chest felt heavier than it ever had before, weighted down by the possibility that he might soon be ordered to surrender it forever. That evening, alone in his modest apartment, Morrison stared at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him showed the wear of decades of military service, scars from combat, lines etched by responsibility and loss. But his eyes still held the determination that had carried him through countless battles. He pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages filled with entries from his years of service. Flipping through the memories, he stopped at an entry from 3 years ago, the day he had first noticed irregularities in the Veteran Support Program's finances. What he had discovered then would change everything, but revealing it would require sacrificing people he cared about. Morrison closed the journal and prepared for what might be his final battle. Tomorrow, the prosecution would continue presenting their case, and soon he would have to decide whether to reveal the truth that could clear his name but destroy others. The Victoria Cross on his nightstand caught the lamplight, a silent reminder of the oath he had taken to protect others, even at the cost of his own life. The real fight was just beginning. Day 2 of the trial brought more devastating testimony. Morrison sat motionless as witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another layer to the prosecution's carefully constructed narrative. Financial analysts explained complex money trails, bank officials described suspicious transactions, and former colleagues spoke about Morrison's apparent desperation for money in recent months. The most damaging testimony came from Sergeant Major William Foster, a man Morrison had once considered a close friend. Foster described how Morrison had approached him about investment opportunities and asked him to sign documents without fully explaining their purpose. The prosecution painted this as evidence of Morrison's manipulation of trusted relationships for personal gain. Morrison's attorney, Major Chen, tried to poke holes in the testimony during cross-examination, but the witnesses seemed well prepared for her questions. Their answers were consistent, their demeanor confident. It was almost as if they had rehearsed their responses perfectly, which troubled Chen more than she let on. During a brief recess, Morrison pulled Chen aside in the hallway. His voice was low, urgent. "Rebecca, there's something you need to know. Something I should have told you from the beginning." But before he could continue, Colonel Hayes approached with a settlement offer. The prosecution was willing to recommend a lighter sentence if Morrison agreed to plead guilty and surrender his Victoria Cross immediately. Chen advised Morrison to consider the offer seriously. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and fighting it might only result in a harsher sentence. But Morrison shook his head firmly. "I won't surrender that medal for something I didn't do," he said quietly. "That cross represents every soldier I've served with, every life saved. I won't dishonor their memory." Back in the courtroom, the prosecution called their star witness, Morrison's former second-in-command, Major Caroline Stewart. Stewart had worked closely with Morrison on the Veteran Support Program, and her testimony would be crucial to proving the charges. She entered the courtroom with military precision, her uniform immaculate, her bearing confident. Stewart's testimony was devastating. She described how Morrison had gradually taken control of the program's finances, dismissing other oversight committee members and centralizing decision-making authority in his own hands. She produced emails and documents that seemed to show Morrison creating fake expenses and diverting funds to accounts he controlled. The most shocking moment came when Stewart revealed that she had been keeping detailed records of Morrison's activities for months before reporting them to military authorities. She had suspected something was wrong, she testified, when Morrison began holding closed-door meetings about the program and excluding other staff members from financial discussions. Morrison watched Stewart testify with a mixture of sadness and recognition. 3 years ago, when he had first discovered the financial irregularities in the Veteran Support Program, Stewart had been the person he trusted most. She had been the one person he had confided in about what he had found, and together they had begun investigating what appeared to be a systematic theft of funds intended for wounded veterans. What Morrison had discovered was far worse than simple embezzlement. The theft was being orchestrated by a network of high-ranking officials who had been skimming money from multiple veteran support programs across different military bases. The amounts involved were staggering, millions of dollars that should have gone to help soldiers suffering from PTSD, physical disabilities, and other service-related injuries. The evidence Morrison had uncovered implicated several generals, defense contractors, and civilian officials who had been working together to exploit the system, but bringing down such powerful people would require absolute proof, and Morrison had been working carefully to gather the evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. Stewart had initially supported Morrison's investigation, but somewhere, along the way, she had been approached by the very people they were investigating. She had been offered a choice: help frame Morrison for the crimes they were committing, or face the destruction of her own career and possibly criminal charges herself. The pressure on Stewart had been immense. She had a family to support, a career she had worked decades to build, and superiors who made it clear that her future depended on her cooperation. Gradually, she had begun providing information about Morrison's investigation to the people he was trying to expose, allowing them to stay one step ahead and eventually turn the tables on him. The fake evidence against Morrison had been meticulously created using inside knowledge of his investigation. Bank accounts had been opened in his name using information Stewart provided. Documents had been forged using his signature samples that Stewart had access to. Witnesses had been coached to provide testimony that would support the false narrative. As Stewart continued her testimony, Morrison realized the full extent of the betrayal. Every piece of evidence the prosecution presented had been crafted to fit a predetermined story. The consistency of witness testimony wasn't due to truthfulness, but careful coordination. The financial records weren't evidence of his guilt, but proof of how thoroughly he had been framed. Morrison's hands clenched into fists under the defendant's table as he listened to Stewart describe his alleged crimes with clinical precision. She spoke about his supposed desperation for money, his gambling problems that didn't exist, his manipulation of trust that was actually his attempt to investigate the real criminals. Major Chen noticed Morrison's agitation and passed him a note, asking if he was all right. Morrison wrote back a single word: lies. Chen looked at him questioningly, but Morrison simply shook his head. He couldn't explain the truth without revealing his investigation, and doing so would alert the real criminals that he was onto them. It would also put Stewart in danger, despite her betrayal of him. When the prosecution finished their questioning of Stewart, Chen rose for cross-examination. She had prepared extensively, but without knowing the full truth of what Morrison had been investigating, her questions seemed to only strengthen Stewart's testimony. Every attempt to challenge Stewart's account was met with detailed explanations that sounded reasonable and consistent. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier as Stewart's testimony continued. Members of the gallery shifted uncomfortably as the prosecution painted an increasingly damning picture of Morrison's alleged crimes. The media representatives took furious notes, already composing headlines about the fallen war hero's betrayal of his fellow veterans. As the day ended, Morrison sat alone in the courthouse hallway, staring at the Victoria Cross on his chest. The weight of the medal seemed to increase with each passing hour, not from shame but from the burden of the truth he carried. He thought about the real victims of the crimes he was being accused of, the veterans who weren't receiving the help they needed because their money was being stolen by corrupt officials. That night, Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He retrieved his hidden evidence files and began preparing for a revelation that would shock the entire courtroom. But first, he had to find a way to protect Stewart from the consequences of her betrayal and ensure that the real criminals couldn't escape when their conspiracy was finally exposed. The next day would bring the moment that would define not only his fate, but the future of military justice itself. The third day of proceedings began with an unexpected development. Morrison had requested a private meeting with Major Chen before court convened, and when they met in the small conference room adjacent to the courtroom, his demeanor was different. Gone was the resigned acceptance of the previous days. In its place was a steely determination that reminded Chen why Morrison had earned his Victoria Cross in the first place. "I need you to listen carefully," Morrison began, pulling out a small, digital recorder and a thick manila envelope. "What I'm about to tell you will change everything, but it will also put lives at risk, including yours and mine." Chen leaned forward, sensing that this was the breakthrough moment she had been hoping for since taking the case. Morrison explained his 3-year investigation into the Veteran Support Program corruption. He revealed how he had discovered a network of high-ranking officials who had been systematically stealing funds meant for wounded veterans. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. It involved generals, defense contractors, and civilian officials across multiple military installations. The envelope contained copies of bank records, recorded conversations, and documented evidence of the real conspiracy. Morrison had been gathering this evidence methodically, knowing that taking down such powerful people would require absolute proof. He had been working with a small group of trusted investigators, including a forensic accountant and a military intelligence officer, to build an airtight case. "Why didn't you come forward with this sooner?" Chen asked, her mind racing through the implications of what Morrison was revealing. Morrison's expression grew pained as he explained about Stewart's betrayal and how the conspiracy had turned the tables on him. He had realized too late that his investigation had been compromised from the inside. The people Morrison was investigating had discovered his activities through Stewart and had decided to eliminate the threat he posed by framing him for their own crimes. They had used their positions and resources to create a convincing false narrative, complete with fabricated evidence and coached witnesses. The prosecution's case wasn't just strong because it was well prepared. It was strong because it had been crafted by the very criminals Morrison had been trying to expose. Chen studied the evidence Morrison provided, her legal mind quickly grasping the significance of what she was seeing. The financial records showed massive transfers of funds through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The recorded conversations included discussions of bribes, kickbacks, and strategies for covering up the theft. Most importantly, the documents showed that Morrison had been building a case against these individuals, not working with them. "This changes everything," Chen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But presenting this evidence will essentially put you at war with some of the most powerful people in the military establishment. Are you prepared for that?" Morrison nodded grimly. He had already lost almost everything: his reputation, his career, and possibly his freedom. But he couldn't let the real criminals escape while innocent veterans continued to suffer. The decision to present the evidence had to be made carefully. Chen realized that simply introducing it during regular proceedings might give the conspirators time to destroy additional evidence or eliminate witnesses. They needed to present it in a way that would maximize its impact and minimize the opportunity for the guilty parties to respond. Chen requested an emergency meeting with Judge Advocate General Wells, claiming that new evidence had come to light that was crucial to the case. Wells, intrigued by the unusual request, agreed to hear what Chen had to present in her chambers before the day's proceedings began. In the judge's private chambers, Chen laid out Morrison's evidence systematically. Wells, a veteran of military justice with decades of experience, recognized immediately that what she was seeing represented a conspiracy of unprecedented scope within the military establishment. The implications were staggering, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire military justice system. Wells studied the documents carefully, her expression growing increasingly grave as she realized the magnitude of what Morrison had uncovered. The evidence was meticulously organized and convincing. More importantly, it explained the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case that had been troubling her since the trial began. "General Wells," Chen said carefully, "we believe that several witnesses in this case have committed perjury, and that the prosecution's evidence has been fabricated by the very people Colonel Morrison was investigating. We're requesting that the court consider these new findings and potentially halt proceedings while a full investigation is conducted." Wells faced an impossible decision. If Morrison's evidence was authentic, it meant that the current trial was not just a miscarriage of justice, but an active conspiracy to frame an innocent man while protecting the real criminals. However, Accepting Morrison's evidence would also mean acknowledging that the military justice system had been manipulated by corrupt officials at the highest levels. After reviewing the evidence for nearly an hour, Wells made her decision. She would allow Morrison's defense team to present the new evidence in open court, but she would also immediately order a parallel investigation by military intelligence to verify the claims. The implications were too serious to ignore, but they were also too serious to accept without thorough verification. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, as Wells announced that the defense had new evidence to present. The prosecution team looked confused and concerned. They had expected to spend the day continuing their systematic destruction of Morrison's reputation. Instead, they found themselves facing an unexpected development that they hadn't prepared for. Morrison took the stand for the first time since the trial began. As he was sworn in, he looked directly at Major Stewart in the gallery, his eyes conveying both sadness and determination. She seemed to understand that everything was about to change, her composed demeanor beginning to crack for the first time since the trial began. Under Chen's careful questioning, Morrison began to tell his story. He explained how he had first noticed irregularities in the Veteran Support Program's finances 3 years ago. He described his growing concern as he discovered that funds meant to help wounded veterans were being diverted through a complex network of fraudulent contracts and shell companies. The courtroom was silent as Morrison detailed his investigation. He explained how he had worked with trusted allies to gather evidence, how he had slowly uncovered the scope of the conspiracy, and how he had been preparing to bring charges against the real criminals when he found himself accused of their crimes. Morrison's testimony was compelling, but Chen knew that the real test would come when she began presenting the documented evidence. The bank records, recorded conversations, and other materials Morrison had gathered would either vindicate him completely or destroy any remaining credibility he had. As Morrison continued his testimony, several people in the gallery began to look uncomfortable. Military officials who had seemed confident in Morrison's guilt now appeared worried. Defense contractors and civilian officials who had attended the trial to watch Morrison's downfall began whispering urgently among themselves. The Tito prosecution team was clearly scrambling to respond to developments they hadn't anticipated. Colonel Hayes requested several brief recesses to consult with his team, but it was obvious that they had no prepared strategy for dealing with Morrison's revelations. When Morrison finished his initial testimony, the courtroom was buzzing with tension and speculation. Everyone present understood that what they had just heard, if true, represented one of the largest military corruption scandals in recent history. More importantly, it meant that many of the people in positions of power and trust had betrayed not just Morrison, but every veteran who depended on the programs they had corrupted. Judge Wells called for an extended recess to allow both sides to prepare for what would clearly be a dramatically different continuation of the trial. As the courtroom emptied, Morrison remained seated at the defendant's table, finally feeling the weight of secrecy lifted from his shoulders. The real battle was about to begin. When court resumed, the atmosphere had completely changed. Major Chen approached the evidence table with a confidence that had been absent during the first 2 days of proceedings. She began systematically presenting Morrison's evidence, starting with the financial records that showed the real money trail behind the Veteran Support Program theft. The first document Chen presented was a forensic accounting report that Morrison's team had prepared. The report traced millions of dollars in stolen funds through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. The money had been systematically diverted from veteran support programs across multiple military bases, using fake contracts and fraudulent invoices to disguise the theft. Chen displayed bank statements on the courtroom's projection screen, highlighting transactions that showed regular transfers of large amounts from veteran support accounts to companies that existed only on paper. The timing of these transfers corresponded exactly with periods when the real perpetrators needed to move money quickly to avoid detection. The evidence showed that the conspiracy had been operating for over 5 years, stealing funds that were meant to provide housing assistance, medical care, job training, and mental health support for veterans returning from combat. The human cost of this theft was immeasurable. Veterans who had suffered in silence because the help they needed wasn't available due to the stolen resources. Colonel Hayes objected repeatedly during Chen's presentation, claiming that the evidence was irrelevant to the charges against Morrison. However, Judge Wells overruled each objection, recognizing that the evidence was directly related to Morrison's defense and his claims of being framed by the real perpetrators. The most dramatic moment came when Chen played recorded conversations that Morrison had secretly made during his investigation. The audio quality was clear, and the voices were easily recognizable to many people in the courtroom. The conversations revealed detailed discussions of bribery schemes, plans to eliminate evidence, and strategies for targeting Morrison when his investigation became a threat. In one particularly damaging recording, General Marcus Thompson, who was present in the courtroom gallery, could be heard discussing how to neutralize the Morrison problem by framing him for the very crimes they were committing. Thompson's voice was unmistakable as he outlined plans to create false evidence and coach witnesses to testify against Morrison. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and electric. General Thompson rose from his seat, his face flushed with anger and panic. Several other high-ranking officials who had been named in the recordings also stood up, clearly preparing to leave the courtroom. Judge Wells quickly ordered the military police to secure all exits and ensure that no one left the building without permission. Chen continued presenting evidence, including emails that showed the coordination between the conspirators. The emails revealed how they had used Stewart to gather information about Morrison's investigation and how they had systematically created false evidence to build the case against him. The level of planning and coordination was sophisticated, showing that the frame-up had been carefully orchestrated over many months. One email chain was particularly damning, showing how the conspirators had discussed Morrison's Victoria Cross and how destroying his reputation would send a message to other potential whistleblowers. They had specifically targeted him not just to eliminate the threat he posed, but to discourage others from investigating military corruption. The evidence also revealed the true scope of the conspiracy's activities. They had been stealing from not just veteran support programs, but also from military construction projects, equipment procurement contracts, and educational benefits programs. The total amount stolen was estimated to be over $50 million, money that had been diverted from programs meant to support active duty soldiers and veterans. Major Stewart, who had been sitting quietly in the gallery throughout Morrison's evidence presentation, suddenly stood up and requested permission to address the court. Judge Wells, surprised by this development, granted permission for Stewart to speak. What happened next shocked everyone present. Stewart walked to the front of the courtroom, her military bearing intact but her face showing the strain of months of deception. She looked directly at Morrison, her eyes filled with regret, and began to speak. "Your Honor, I need to confess to perjury and conspiracy in this case. Everything I testified to over the past 2 days was false, and I was coerced into providing that testimony." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs, but Wells quickly restored order. Stewart continued, explaining how she had been approached by the conspirators and threatened with the destruction of her career and criminal charges if she didn't cooperate in framing Morrison. She described the pressure she had been under and the guilt that had been eating at her since agreeing to betray her former commander. Stewart's confession was devastating to the prosecution's case, but it was also personally heartbreaking for Morrison. Despite her betrayal, he could see the pain in her eyes and understood the impossible position she had been placed in. The conspirators had exploited her loyalty to her family and her fear of losing everything she had worked for. Chen seized on Stewart's confession to request that all of Stewart's previous testimony be stricken from the record as perjured. She also requested that Stewart be granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation in testifying truthfully about the conspiracy and the coercion she had experienced. Judge Wells granted both requests, recognizing that Stewart's cooperation would be crucial to unraveling the full extent of the conspiracy. Stewart was sworn in again and began providing truthful testimony about how the frame-up had been orchestrated and who had been involved in planning and executing it. Stewart's new testimony corroborated everything Morrison had claimed about his investigation and the conspiracy against him. She provided details about meetings where the conspirators had planned Morrison's downfall, discussed how evidence had been fabricated, and described the threats and inducements used to secure her cooperation. The most shocking revelation came when Stewart testified that the prosecution team had been aware that their case was built on fabricated evidence. Colonel Hayes and his team had been briefed by the conspirators about the need to ensure Morrison's conviction, and they had been provided with the false evidence knowing its true origin. This revelation sent shockwaves through the military justice system. The idea that military prosecutors had knowingly pursued charges based on fabricated evidence represented a fundamental breach of legal ethics and justice. Hayes immediately requested a recess to consult with his superiors, but the damage to his credibility was already done. As Stewart's testimony continued, more details emerged about the conspiracy's methods and reach. She described how they had infiltrated multiple levels of the military hierarchy, corrupting officers and officials across different branches of service. The conspiracy had been operating like a criminal organization within the military structure itself. The evidence presentation took the entire day, and by the time court recessed, it was clear that Morrison's case had been completely transformed. What had begun as a seemingly straightforward prosecution of a corrupt officer had become an exposé of systematic corruption at the highest levels of military leadership. As the courtroom emptied that evening, several of the implicated officials were taken into custody by military investigators. The parallel investigation that Judge Wells had ordered was already yielding results, with financial institutions providing additional evidence of the money laundering schemes Morrison had uncovered. Morrison sat quietly at the defendant's table as the room cleared, finally allowing himself to feel a sense of vindication. The truth was finally coming to light, but he knew that the battle was far from over. The people he had been fighting were powerful and desperate, and they would not give up easily. The next day would bring even more revelations as the full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge. The fourth day of proceedings brought a courtroom packed beyond capacity. Word of Morrison's evidence and Stewart's confession had spread throughout the military community overnight, and the implications of what was unfolding had drawn attention from the highest levels of government. Media representatives filled every available seat, while military officials stood along the walls, all waiting to witness what promised to be a historic day in military justice. Judge Wells entered the courtroom with an unusual escort of military investigators and security personnel. The parallel investigation she had ordered had worked through the night, and the results were more extensive than anyone had anticipated. Additional evidence had been uncovered, more witnesses had come forward, and several key figures in the conspiracy had been arrested in pre-dawn raids. The prosecution table was noticeably different. Colonel Hayes was no longer present, having been relieved of his duties pending investigation into his role in knowingly presenting fabricated evidence. His replacement, Colonel Sarah Martinez, approached the bench to request permission to address the court before proceedings continued. Martinez, a respected military prosecutor known for her integrity, made an unprecedented announcement. After reviewing the evidence that had emerged over the past 24 hours, the prosecution was formally withdrawing all charges against Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. Furthermore, the military was launching a comprehensive investigation into the conspiracy that had targeted him, and criminal charges were being prepared against the real perpetrators. The courtroom erupted in surprised conversations and murmurs of vindication. Morrison closed his eyes briefly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that had been pressing down on him for months. But his relief was tempered by the knowledge that the fight for justice was just beginning for the veterans who had been robbed of the support they deserved. Judge Wells called for order and announced that while the charges against Morrison were being dropped, the court would continue to serve as a forum for presenting evidence about the conspiracy. She explained that the proceedings would now focus on documenting the full scope of the crimes that had been committed and ensuring that all responsible parties were held accountable. Major Chen approached the podium to make a statement on Morrison's behalf. She thanked the court for its commitment to justice and announced that Morrison would be filing civil lawsuits against the conspirators to recover damages for the harm done to his reputation and career. More importantly, she revealed that Morrison was establishing a foundation to ensure that the stolen funds would be recovered and directed to the veterans who had been deprived of support. The most dramatic moment came when General Thompson was brought into the courtroom in custody. The man who had once commanded respect throughout the military hierarchy now appeared diminished and desperate. His arrest had triggered a cascade of additional investigations as authorities worked to uncover the full extent of his involvement in the conspiracy. Thompson's attorney requested permission for his client to make a statement, apparently hoping to negotiate some form of plea agreement. However, Thompson's statement backfired spectacularly when he attempted to justify his actions by claiming that he had been trying to protect military budgets from inefficient spending. His callous attitude toward the veterans who had been harmed by his crimes only served to deepen the outrage in the courtroom. More evidence continued to emerge throughout the day. Military investigators presented financial records showing that Thompson and his co-conspirators had stolen over $75 million from various veteran support programs over a 6-year period. The money had been used to purchase luxury homes, expensive cars, and investments that funded lavish lifestyles while veterans struggled with homelessness, untreated injuries, and inadequate care. The human cost of the conspiracy became clear as several veterans took the witness stand to describe how the theft of funds had affected their lives. Master Sergeant Rebecca Davis testified about waiting 2 years for housing assistance that never came because the money had been stolen. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres described how his PTSD treatment program had been canceled due to budget constraints while the program's funds were being diverted to the conspirators' accounts. Perhaps the most heartbreaking testimony came from the widow of Sergeant First Class David Kim, who had committed suicide after being denied mental health services that should have been available through the Veteran Support Program. The funds that could have saved her husband's life had instead been used to purchase a vacation home for one of the conspirators. Morrison listened to each testimony with growing determination to see justice done. The Victoria Cross on his chest, which had seemed so heavy during the first days of the trial, now felt like a reminder of his duty to protect and serve those who had served alongside him. He realized that his investigation and the subsequent frame-up had been about more than just his own vindication. It had been about defending the honor and dignity of every veteran who depended on the military's promise to care for those who had sacrificed for their country. As the day continued, more conspirators were identified and arrested. Defense contractors who had created fake companies to receive stolen funds found themselves in custody. Civilian officials who had facilitated the money laundering schemes were removed from their positions. The conspiracy, which had seemed so powerful and untouchable just days before, was rapidly unraveling as investigators followed the money trails Morrison had uncovered. Stewart took the stand again to provide additional testimony about the conspiracy's operations. Her detailed knowledge of the planning and execution of Morrison's frame-up provided crucial evidence for the criminal cases being prepared against the conspirators. She also revealed the existence of additional evidence that Morrison had hidden as insurance against retaliation. This additional evidence included recorded conversations with even higher-ranking officials, financial documents showing the involvement of defense contractors in multiple fraud schemes, and correspondence that revealed plans to target other potential whistleblowers within the military. The scope of the corruption was broader and deeper than anyone had initially realized. Judge Wells announced that the evidence being presented would be forwarded to both military and civilian law enforcement agencies for prosecution. The crimes uncovered went beyond military jurisdiction and involved violations of federal fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering laws. The conspirators would face justice in both military and civilian courts. The proceedings also revealed the sophisticated methods the conspirators had used to avoid detection. They had created complex networks of shell companies, used offshore, banking to hide stolen funds, and systematically corrupted oversight mechanisms designed to prevent exactly the kind of theft they were committing. Their success had depended not just on greed, but on the exploitation of trust within the military community. As the day drew to a close, Morrison was approached by several veterans advocacy groups who had been following the trial. They thanked him for his courage in exposing the conspiracy and asked for his continued involvement in ensuring that the stolen funds were recovered and properly distributed to those who needed them. Morrison agreed to work with the advocacy groups, recognizing that his fight was far from over. While his name had been cleared and his reputation restored, the real work of helping the veterans who had been harmed by the conspiracy was just beginning. The stolen funds needed to be recovered, New oversight mechanisms needed to be established, and the military's veteran support systems needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. That evening, Morrison returned home to his wife Sarah for the first time in months, with his head held high. The Victoria Cross on his chest once again represented honor rather than burden, and he knew that his service to his fellow veterans was entering a new and crucial phase. The courtroom had been shocked by his revelations, but the real shock would come when the full extent of the conspiracy's damage became clear, and the long process of rebuilding trust and restoring justice began. 6 months after the trial that shocked the military establishment, Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison stood before a gathering of over 3,000 veterans at the National War Memorial. The man who had once faced disgrace and the loss of his Victoria Cross was now being honored with the Distinguished Service Medal for his courage in exposing one of the largest military corruption scandals in history. The intervening months had been a whirlwind of investigations, trials, and reform efforts. The conspiracy Morrison had uncovered ultimately led to the conviction of 17 high-ranking military officials, 23 defense contractors, and 11 civilian administrators. General Thompson received a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, while his co-conspirators faced terms ranging from 5 to 15 years. More importantly for Morrison, the stolen funds were being recovered and redirected to their intended purposes. The Morrison Foundation, established with the support of veterans advocacy groups, had successfully recovered over $60 million of the stolen money. These funds were now being used to provide housing assistance, medical care, job training, and mental health services to thousands of veterans who had been denied help during the conspiracy's operation. The ceremony at the War Memorial was particularly meaningful because it was attended by many of the veterans who had been helped by the recovered funds. Master Sergeant Rebecca Davis, who had testified about waiting years for housing assistance, was now living in a home purchased through the Foundation's housing program. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres had completed his PTSD treatment and was working as a counselor helping other veterans deal with similar challenges. Morrison's speech to the gathered veterans focused not on his own vindication, but on the importance of protecting those who had served their country. He spoke about the obligation that military leaders had to ensure that promises made to veterans were kept, and about the need for constant vigilance against those who would exploit the trust placed in them. The Victoria Cross I wear belongs not to me, but to every soldier who has served with honor, Morrison said, his voice carrying across the memorial grounds. When I was ordered to surrender this medal, I refused not because of pride, but because surrendering it would have meant abandoning my duty to protect those who served alongside me. Today, I wear it not as a symbol of past heroism, but as a commitment to future service. The audience erupted in sustained applause, with many veterans rising to their feet in recognition of Morrison's sacrifice and dedication. The ceremony was being broadcast live on military television networks, and messages of support poured in from military bases around the world. Major Stewart, who had been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation, was also present at the ceremony. Her testimony had been crucial in securing convictions against the conspiracy's leaders, and she had spent the past 6 months working with military investigators to identify other potential corruption schemes. The guilt she felt about her initial betrayal of Morrison had motivated her to become one of the most effective investigators in rooting out military corruption. Stewart approached Morrison after the ceremony, her eyes still carrying the weight of her past actions. "I know I can never undo what I did to you," she said quietly. "But I want you to know that every day I work to expose corruption, I'm trying to honor the trust I violated." Morrison placed a hand on her shoulder, understanding the burden she carried and the courage it had taken for her to finally tell the truth. The impact of Morrison's case extended far beyond the individuals who were prosecuted. The military had implemented comprehensive reforms to its veteran support programs, including new oversight mechanisms, regular audits, and whistleblower protections for those who reported suspected corruption. The Morrison case, as it became known, was now taught at military academies as an example of both the importance of integrity and the courage required to uphold it. Judge Advocate General Patricia Wells, who had presided over the trial, was promoted to head a new military ethics oversight committee. Her careful handling of Morrison's case and her commitment to uncovering the truth had earned her recognition as a champion of military justice. She often spoke about the Morrison case as a reminder that the military justice system worked best when it remained open to evidence and committed to truth over convenience. The defense contractors and civilian officials who had participated in the conspiracy faced not only criminal penalties but also civil lawsuits that resulted in additional fund recovery for veteran programs. The complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts they had created to hide stolen money was systematically dismantled, with the recovered assets being returned to their intended purposes. Morrison's investigation techniques became a model for other military investigators dealing with complex fraud cases. The methodical approach he had used to gather evidence, the careful documentation of financial irregularities, and his persistence in the face of powerful opposition were studied and replicated in investigations across all branches of the military. The veteran community rallied around Morrison not just as a symbol of vindication, but as a continuing advocate for their needs. The Morrison Foundation expanded its mission beyond recovering stolen funds to include advocacy for veteran rights, support for whistleblowers who reported military corruption, and education about the importance of transparency in military spending. 1 year after the trial, Morrison was invited to testify before Congress about military corruption and the need for stronger oversight of veteran programs. His testimony led to new legislation that provided additional protections for military whistleblowers and established independent oversight committees for all veteran support programs. Morrison's wife, Sarah, who had stood by him throughout the ordeal, became involved in supporting the families of other military whistleblowers. She understood the unique pressures faced by those who chose to speak truth to power within the military hierarchy, and she worked to provide them with the emotional and practical support they needed to persevere. The Victoria Cross that Morrison had refused to surrender became a powerful symbol within the military community. It represented not just historical heroism, but contemporary courage, the willingness to fight for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. Young officers throughout the military began to see Morrison's example as proof that integrity and perseverance could triumph over corruption and abuse of power. Morrison continued his military service for 2 more years before retiring with full honors. His final assignment was as special advisor on military ethics and transparency, a position created specifically to institutionalize the lessons learned from his case. In this role, he helped develop new training programs for military leaders on their obligations to veterans and the importance of maintaining ethical standards in all military operations. At his retirement ceremony, Morrison was surrounded by hundreds of veterans whose lives had been improved by the funds recovered through his investigation. The ceremony concluded with Morrison finally being allowed to speak the words he had held back for so long during his trial. Mission accomplished. Every veteran who needed help has been served, every dollar stolen has been recovered, and every corrupt official has been held accountable. As Morrison walked away from active military service, he carried with him the knowledge that his refusal to surrender his Victoria Cross had been about more than preserving his own honor. It had been about preserving the honor of the military itself and ensuring that the promises made to those who served would be kept. The courtroom that had once witnessed his near disgrace had instead become the stage for one of the most important victories in military justice history. Morrison's shocking revelation had not only saved his career, it had saved the integrity of the entire veteran support system and ensured that future generations of veterans would receive the care and support they had earned through their service.